The strategic tectonic plates are shifting, old alliances coming ever closer together, new alliances being formed, people queuing up to join the BRICS, one of the great rising suns based in the East. Putin's visit to Pyongyang and the new strategic agreement signed between Russia and North Korea, the growing closeness of Iran, China, and Russia and other countries, which may well extend to geostrategic as well as economic closeness. The picture is changing everywhere. China is in Nicaragua. Russia is back in Cuba. The United States arming Russia's enemies around its borders has backfired spectacularly upon them, with Russia now in the situation that it's ready to get closer and closer, including militarily, with all those threatened by the American-led Western empire. Of course, the empire is not made of paper. It is cutting people to shreds in the Gaza Strip and indeed in the south of Lebanon. War everywhere is still in the air. The empire is threatening China, threatening Russia, threatening Iran, threatening Yemen, threatening the Palestinians, threatening the Lebanese. But the difference is that any and all of these adversaries are ready and now able to fight back. And that leaves the possibility that the empire will have to make a humiliating climb down on all of the fronts that it is currently threatening aggression, war, and destruction. The resistance in Gaza is undefeated. The resistance in Lebanon is bristling with determination to confront any new aggression from the apartheid state. The Yemenis have never been quietened and are humiliating the air forces and the navies of the most powerful parts of the Western Empire. China sails on regardless of all of the yapping that goes on at her heels. Iran has emerged from a period of sanction and aggression and even acts of war and is now standing tall on the international stage. These are all remarkable transformations. And the Genocide 7, otherwise known as the G7, is beginning to look distinctly dog-eared and ragged. The economies of the Western countries are languishing where they are not actually plummeting. Internally, inside Germany, inside France, inside the United States, and yes, even inside perfidious Albion, in Great Britain itself. New forces, huge forces of opposition to the regimes governing Western countries are emerging. Some of them you might like, some of them you might not like, but the center is dead. It is disappearing, sinking into the swamp of neoliberalism with neocon policies abroad that they have taken their countries into. Macron is languishing in third place. Little soldier Schulz and bonkers Baerbock will not survive the forthcoming general elections, may not even survive in time to reach them. Joe Biden may fall off the stage in the presidential debates, or his trousers might well fall down, heaven forfend. The leaders of the Western Alliance look weak and look confused. The leaders of the new world that is arising with the sun rising firmly in the east are looking more and more confident, more and more competent. Of course, war could end it all. We've never been closer to an exchange of nuclear weapons than we are today. But that would be a last and desperate throw by the empire, which could bring about the end of human life on the planet, the very definition of a Pyrrhic victory. It may well be, though, that the public opinion in France at the end of this month, in Britain at the beginning of next month, that political shifts begin to accompany these tectonic plate shifts that are going on in the world. You've come to the right place to hear experts and indeed the public debate it. You've come to have it out with Galloway. Donald Coulter is an American in Moscow, an American journalist, filmmaker, and political analyst, second to none anywhere in the world. He knows what's going on in the East and, of course, in the West. He's just been on one of the expeditions of the century with the Russian President Vladimir Putin's party in Pyongyang. How about that? Here's what he was up to.
So the event on Kim Il-sung Square has come to an end, and we're driving to a different location now, and so many people throughout the streets, we've been saying hi to them this whole time, have been, crowds of people down the road for kilometers and kilometers here to welcome the Russian delegation and Vladimir Putin here. This grandiose warm welcome on Kim Il-sung Square in the center of Pyongyang has just come to an end, that the people of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea have organized for this visit of Russian President Vladimir Putin. As you can see, there's thousands of them on the square, around 50,000. I've been filming so much that my camera overheated, so I gotta go on my telephone now, but look at how crazy awesome this parade. We're here now in Hanoi, Vietnam, where Vladimir Putin is just about expected to arrive.
Who among us would not have liked to be on that trip? Well, the man himself is here to tell us how it was. Donald, it must have been amazing. There was Pyongyang looking shiny and brand new, I must say, surprising a lot of people who've been led astray by Western propaganda about Korea. Vietnam, now one of the booming economies of the East, indeed of the world. Vladimir Putin getting a hero's welcome in both countries. Russia doesn't look as isolated as Western media like to tell us it is.
That's absolutely true. I mean, Russia is not at all isolated. If anything, this recent trip to the DPRK and Vietnam by Russian President Vladimir Putin is just one indication of the fact that Russia is not isolated at all. I mean, it's kind of like when the West says that Russia's isolated, it's kind of like they're consuming their own propaganda, right? In which they believe that the West is the entire world, when in reality, it's a small percentage of the world's landmass. It's, a small percentage of the world's population. The rest of the world either has pretty much a neutral attitude towards Russia or a friendly one. And this recent trip that Vladimir Putin made to the DPRK is really bad news for Western imperialism, actually. It's the first time that Vladimir Putin's visited the DPRK in nearly a quarter of a century. And it's the first time since the 1970s, when Nicolae Ceausescu visited Pyongyang, that such a grand welcoming was made for a foreign dignitary. This is the first time since the 70s. I mean, the people that we spoke to in North Korea said that there were around 50,000 people in the square participating in this welcome demonstration. I would say there were even more, because there were for kilometers and kilometers people just standing on these roads welcoming the delegation. And they had been preparing for 3 months to put this stuff together. I mean, they really went all out to welcome the Russian president and the delegation. I mean, for them, it was like a holiday. And with this new treaty that was signed between Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong-un, this comprehensive treaty on strategic partnership, I mean, this is like really bad news for Western imperialism. Essentially, it's a mutual defense pact, right? I mean, it stipulates that if there's any aggression, military aggression against the DPRK, Russia's going to step in and back them up, and vice versa. Now, you know, the possibility of North Korea sending even troops to Ukraine is on the table. I mean, I spoke to Vladimir Putin at the press conference in Vietnam. He said that's not likely what's going to come out of this, but there's no saying whether or not Russia is going to start supplying the DPRK with long-range missiles that could potentially hit the United States if the United States is going to continue supplying Ukraine and even giving them Western intelligence and Western specialists to launch these missiles into Russian territory and keep killing civilians. If they're going to keep that up, Russia's going to start arming the DPRK. I mean, that's exactly what we saw in Crimea. I mean, according to Russia's defense ministry, these long-range ATACMS missiles that killed 4 people, injured over 150 others, and two children were among the dead. These were apparently even aimed by American specialists using American intelligence.
Well, we'll come back to Crimea in a minute, but this shift in alliances, they're not new alliances, of course. Russia was seminal in the successful Vietnamese Revolution, which reunited their country. Russia defended the Vietnamese people, armed them against first French and then United States aggression. Both Russia and China defended Korea in its long and very arduous struggle against those that occupied it and enslaved it, actually, during the Japanese occupation and during the attempted American occupation of the peninsula in the 1950s. So these are not new alliances, but they are now far closer alliances than they were before. And Russia was very close to Cuba. Then there was an interregnum where Cuba was left standing more or less alone. Now the Russians are back in Cuba. And why would Russia not give long-range missiles to Cuba and North Korea when the United States is giving long-range missiles to all the countries surrounding and threatening Russia?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this goes back to something you mentioned earlier. I mean, essentially that Western imperialism, Washington, they become their own gravediggers with their aggressive policies towards Russia, towards the rest of the world. I mean, like you said, George, of course, yeah, these alliances, these partnerships between Russia and countries like Vietnam and the DPRK have existed for a long time. Russia already had an agreement with the DPRK. This recent visit was actually to update the older one. But it goes without saying that where we're seeing this much tighter, deeper cooperation in the military sphere, it's a reaction to the way the West is treating countries that are trying to assert their sovereignty, countries that the West is trying to sanction out of existence. This aggressive policy towards these countries is not working. It's just uniting them against Western imperialism, and it's going to make it more difficult for Western pressure to accomplish anything. I mean, for the longest time, North Korea was, North Korea is still one of the most sanctioned countries in the world, right? When I went to Pyongyang, there were new apartment blocks propping up everywhere. I mean, that I looked at them, and the first thing I thought back to when I lived in the United States and how in the richest country in the world, people are struggling to pay their rent for, not even new apartment buildings, apartments that are old or just like worn down, but they're somewhere near New York, so they're astronomically expensive. When meanwhile, these new apartment buildings in Pyongyang are like state of the art and they're free of charge to people living there. I mean, how that should be at least a one eye opener for people in the West, that maybe all the Western propaganda about North Korea is not exactly what it seems to be. And that could be said for any country that is targeted by the West. I mean, all this propaganda against Russia too, right? I mean, that Russia's Vladimir Putin's a dictator. Everyone's living in fear in Russia. The economy is collapsing. None of that's true. I mean, it just goes to show they don't understand at all the sentiment in Russia right now. I mean, I really believe that the recent Russian presidential elections, in which there was record turnout, record popularity and support for Vladimir Putin, that was not a rigged election. That was the Russian people reacting to attempts from the West to intimidate their country, intimidate their people, and pressure them into surrendering. And the Russian people rose up in the presidential election and they said, we're not going to stand for this. We're going to support our president who's defending our sovereign interests.
Well, the ways in which the West picks on countries does tend to unify those countries behind their government and unify them as a people. It happened in Cuba over many decades. It happened in Venezuela after all the attempts to regime change Venezuela, even appointing a stranger off the street and calling him the president of Venezuela. Now he's a student in Florida, although I hope he's not sitting on the gold bullion that was granted to him in the brief interregnum of his presidency. But the same is true in Iran. Look at the efforts they've made to divide the people of Iran. Wave after wave of efforts. Terrorism, fake color revolutions, and so on. The people in Iran are, you saw that in the funerals for President Raisi. The people of Iran are united in their millions, tens of millions, behind their government. So these efforts by the West have turned into really a bit of a boomerang, don't you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it really does seem like the the most evil so-called dictators in the Western propaganda narrative end up having the most people turn up for their funerals crying over this absolute tragedy, right? I mean, it just it was the same. I mean, where if you look at the funerals in all of the capitals of the Soviet republics for Joseph Stalin, right? That's one of the evil demons of the Western narrative. Every time, I mean, Kim Il Sung, Kim Jong Il, their funerals, tons of people came crying, you know, seeing it as a tragedy, right? And in Iran, again, we saw the funeral, the multi-day mourning period for the deceased President Raisi. Millions of people out in the street, right? You know, spending their time showing their respect to their fallen leader that they loved and they really had a lot of admiration for. He was a popular guy, and for people in the West to say it's good that he died, that he was a butcher, I mean, nobody in Iran except for extremists essentially would buy that narrative.
Well, not many people will be turning out for the funerals, metaphorical or literal funerals, of the Western leaders that orchestrate this kind of propaganda. Schulz has the support of around 12% of the German public, Macron of around 18%. Rishi Sunak, don't even get me started on him. Joe Biden, whose political funeral looks certain in November, nobody will be crying over that. Nobody will be out on the street mourning the passing, literally or metaphorically, of any of these Western leaders that call other countries' leaders tyrants and dictators and make out that they are only there because of force rather than popular support.
Absolutely. I mean, just today on Twitter, I saw a picture. It said, who would you want to be your president? And there was a picture of Biden and a picture of Kim Jong-un. I mean, come on, like all of these people that are apparently dictators that the West is calling dictators, they've done so much more than their country for their countries than people like Joe Biden, like you mentioned, Olaf Scholz, Macron is another one. I mean, Rishi Sunak. Is this the best that the Western world has to offer in terms of politicians? I mean, it's like an absolute joke. In the United States, the elections for the past 2 or 3 election cycles have been remembered by most people as just a choice between two really bad people and choosing the one that sucks less. I mean, is that really what democracy is supposed to be? That's what it's come to essentially. Meanwhile, these in countries like the DPRK and Russia and in Iran that are supposedly undemocratic dictatorships. I mean, these people are very popular, and they've done a lot to earn that popularity as well. I mean, Russian President Vladimir Putin, for example, has not been in power for as long as he has been through force and dictatorship. I mean, the country was completely different when he came into office. It was reeling from the consequences of the 1990s. That was basically Wild West bandit capitalism that came after the fall of the Soviet Union. And now Russia is back on its feet and completely independent, essentially. And like we were talking about before, the West has actually a lot of part to play in that, because Vladimir Putin for the longest time was trying to conduct mutually beneficial business relations with the West. And the West was telling him, no, you're a dictatorship. You don't have the right to exist in the world economy on the same plane that we get to exist. And that is exactly what has forced Russia into becoming a super independent economy, essentially.
It's also true on the periphery, the countries that have one foot in the West and one foot in the East. I happened to be in Abu Dhabi when President Putin arrived there. And to say he got a 21-gun salute, 5-star welcome, deepest of red carpets, is seriously to understate it. The Emirates Air Force flew the colors of the Russian flag, the welcome that he received in that part of the Arab world that hasn't yet made the final strategic choice. It's very obvious that things are not as we are told they are. The African leaders who all beat a path to China, to Russia, which helped them in the liberation struggle, and both China and Russia, and now, especially in the case of China, through the Belt and Road Initiative, is developing these African economies, freeing their people from the yoke of post-colonialism. The popularity of the people we are told in the West are pariahs is exponentially greater than that of the liars that lead the West.
Yeah, George, and I've traveled pretty much to many countries in Africa with Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and his diplomatic tour. I've talked to a lot of African government officials at various international forums that Russia's held, and I think one of the main things that plays into what you just said is something that I've heard repeated to me over and over, but from African diplomats and politicians from all countries and the African continent. And that's the fact that Russia and China are very easy to do business with and cooperate with because there's no strings attached to their cooperation. I mean, the way that Russia and China are doing business in Africa is not saying you can do business with us, but if you do, then you can't do business with the West. They're saying we're giving you conditions that are more beneficial and more advantageous for you than the ones that the Western companies or governments are offering you. They're basically competing in terms of they're basically engaging in free competition the way it's supposed to work in the international so-called free markets, whereas the actual Western world that talks about freedom and democracy and free markets themselves, the way they do things in Africa is that it's an exclusive package. They try to pressure countries into not doing business with China and Russia. They try to say that they're imperialist. They threaten countries with sanctions that have some sort of connections with Russia and China. I mean, look at Zimbabwe, right? A country that is actually in the region, according to the Zimbabwean president, when I did an interview with him just last month. He said that the Zimbabwean economy is one of the fastest growing in the region, and it's closely tied with Russia and China. It's also heavily sanctioned by the West. Go figure, right? This is why cooperating with Russia and China and inviting all this Chinese and Russian investment into the continent is something that Africa on the whole is welcoming with open arms. There's no strings attached, whereas the West is essentially trying to corner the markets through intimidation. They're trying to make the so-called free market unfree.
Donald Courter, I wish I was your travel agent and traveling with you. Thanks very much for joining us on Have It Out with Galloway. Let's turn now. One of the unique features of this show is that the public get to appear on screen. It's not just a phone-in, it's a film-in. And first up is in London. Very old friend of mine, haven't seen her for many years, Constance Campion Awad. Constance, thanks for joining us on the video wall. Very nice to hear from you again. What would you like to ask?
Well, first of all, George, I'd like to commend you as a politician and as a leader, and I hope a future leader, on your serious contribution to the Palestinian cause and as a humanitarian in respect of what's happening in the West, in Ukraine, and the death of so many. But I want to ask you, you know, as serious students of national security know that in this mad, mutually assured destruction world, Ronald Reagan, his incandescent insight remains a fundamental truth. A nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. As certainly as it did during half a century of Cold War, and even though Butcher Biden himself knows that America's own survival requires finding ways to defend and advance their national interests without engaging in a direct conflict with Russia, we cannot escape the fact, however, that Putin commands a nuclear arsenal of at least 6,000 nuclear weapons. That is fully capable of destroying the United States and Europe, which would kill us all. Although I think challenging the two leading parties of the arse, as I call them, needs a few pinprick questions when they come knocking on the door, we need to ask them what is to be gained from this senseless war. What will the Workers' Party answer to that, George?
Well, eloquent as always, Constance. Your eloquence has not diminished since I last saw you. I must tell you I'm very worried. I haven't in the past been worried. I was worried, frightened actually, as a child during the Cuban Missile Crisis, hearing my parents talk about the possibility that the world would be destroyed. I have not actually been as worried ever since, even during the mad world of Ronald Reagan and the sighting of cruise missiles in Europe and the rest. The pulling out of the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, the re-nuclear armament of frontline states, the war games of NATO that seem to be endless, ever larger, ever more threatening. And Russia can't know, for example, when one of these war games turns out not to be a game, but in fact an actual attack. The arming of frontline states surrounding Russia with long-range weaponry that no one can know what's in the tip of that missile. The Russian defenses cannot know if one of these long-range missiles is tipped conventionally or tipped with nuclear weapons, and will have to treat them just the same. Otherwise, it would be criminally irresponsible of the Russian leadership to do that, because that could be the last mistake they ever made. We must pray, I do pray, that those with real power in the United States, who really run the show, for it isn't Biden to be sure, don't actually want to see an end of the world. That would be an odd ambition, even for a red in tooth and claw capitalist, to want to see an end to all wealth, all production, all the customers, all the manufacturers, and so on. That would be a very peculiar ambition. But here's my biggest fear, Constance, that the Americans think a nuclear war can be confined to Europe, that it can be fought with first battlefield and then intermediate range nuclear missiles, that it would not go ballistic, intercontinental ballistic, and that they, protected by two oceans, might be the ones to survive it. So if you're not living there, that's not a very reassuring scenario. And of course, if you are living there, it's in cloud cuckoo land. I heard the Chinese leader say once, I know that the United States can destroy China many times over. I am content that China can destroy the United States only once. Brilliant question. Constance got us off to a great start. Let's stay constant and go to George Constanti in Cyprus. George, welcome.
Good evening, George. Thanks very much. Actually, this is the second time I'm talking to you. If you remember,
yes,
we spoke on a remote program about 2 weeks ago.
Yes.
On the subject of the European elections. Our theme tonight is Ukraine, so I'll try to limit myself to that.
Yeah.
But full disclosure, as you know, I'm calling from Cyprus. I'm a Greek-speaking citizen of the Republic of Cyprus. Normally, if people ask me who I am and where I'm from, I say I'm a Greek Cypriot. And beyond that, I'm also an Orthodox Christian. But those two descriptions, unfortunately, within the context of Cyprus, and I think it equally applies to other situations, for example, Gaza that we've just been talking about, and also the Ukraine, this is a very toxic mix, because I think that was the base root of one of the causes of the mess that we're currently in. In 2003, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, together with President Jimmy Carter, was part of a delegation which came to Cyprus to look at the issue of missing persons. There's actually a committee which was set up to investigate, in fact, to find the locations of the sites where the bodies are buried. And what I mean by missing persons, this was after the 1974 invasion of Cyprus by Turkey, which resulted now in a division of the island. The north is controlled, is under occupation. It has a Turkish Cypriot administration, but Turkey calls the shots. And for some time now, I think the figure is about over 3,500. That's diminished now because there's been a lot of cooperation now, and also with the technology moving on in terms of DNA, they've been able to identify quite a few of those who are missing. And we're talking about competence and non-competence. And the problem was that most of these locations are in the north, which are the occupied areas, and obviously the Turkish authorities there weren't all that cooperative, but in more recent years they've been a little more amenable. One of the remarks which Desmond Tutu made at the time was that Cyprus needs a truth commission, basically to sort out what went wrong, for people to admit they've done wrong, and what we need to put it right. And to get on with it, very much along the lines that has happened in South Africa with the truth and
George, I was one of the beneficiaries of that truth and reconciliation process in post-apartheid South Africa, where a due recompense was made to me for vicious assault made upon me by an apartheid policeman in the Guguletu police station. So I'm all for truth and reconciliation, but the truth has to come first. And truth is in short supply in Western narratives today. The Save the Children Fund in Gaza, for example, have just released the astounding finding that there may be as many as 21,000 children that are missing one way or another. Not all will be dead, though many may well be. Some are entirely separated from their parents. Others are under the rubble still. The way in which you move forward from periods of conflict has to start with the truth. Who did what to whom, and what was the real reason that they did it? So I'm all for it in Cyprus. One day we'll get to it in Palestine. We have, to an extent, begun it in post-apartheid South Africa, but not completed it. Economic justice has not yet been achieved. And of course in Ireland, whilst precarious, the process goes on. So thanks for that tour of the Cypriot battlefields, as it were. Let's go to the northeast of Scotland, where Nicola Curtin is on the line. Nicola, welcome.
Right, yeah, thanks for giving me the chance to chat with you. I'm a big fan of what you're doing, and I wish good luck to all our candidates up and down the country. I think this is exactly the type of politics this country needs that you're offering. But my question tonight is, how will the collapse of the US petrodollar, affect America's ability to supply the likes of Ukraine with weapons?
Well, it affects it vitally, Nicola, if the crash actually happens. It has not happened yet, and we shouldn't oversell what has happened so far. There is, as yet, no BRICS currency. There needs to be. It's true that Russia and China are now excluding the US dollar from all of their trading, and you might well ask why they ever used the US dollar in the first place. You can scarcely find a reason for it, but they've ended it now. The Moscow stock market has stopped trading in dollars. Again, ditto, you might well ask why it ever did. And these are all responses to the actually short-sighted and foolish actions of the Western governments in, first of all, seizing other people's sovereign wealth. They did it with Venezuela, as you know. The Bank of England froze Venezuela's sovereign wealth and tried at least to give it to that student in Florida that I was talking about earlier. The Western countries have seized hundreds of billions of dollars worth of Russian assets. And bad enough freezing them, they are busily trying to find ways of handing them to the other pretender, Mr. Zelensky, to do with as he will please. So they've shot themselves in the foot. Nobody in their right mind would ever put their wealth in Western capitals, banks again. And nobody with any ability to do so will continue to trade in dollars. Now, Saudi Arabia is trading both in dollars and in yuan and in rubles. It is moving away from the post-1973 US petrodollar deal, but it has not yet broken with it. The petrodollar is the only remaining basis for the dollar to pretend that it is a reserve currency. Otherwise, it's just worthless paper. And the United States and other countries, our own included, are now spending more on debt servicing than we are on many of our biggest ticket items. In the US case, defense. You thought you couldn't get a bigger ticket than the American defense budget, but America is spending more servicing its debt than even it is on spending on defense. You can only do that if other countries are using your currency as a reserve currency. And the faster and more completely that people move away from the dollar, the quicker we'll reach a dollar-free world, and then all bets are off. And the United States will have to get back again to producing actual wealth rather than printing worthless pieces of paper. Nicola, thank you for that call. Derej Yemeru is all the way in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia. I'm very glad to go back to Addis. Welcome, sir. What would you like to ask?
Good evening, George. How are you? Actually, I have two questions. The first one is that to what end does this money laundering scheme of the West and the EU turned as we all know, we have seen that the EU turned their economy into a war economy, and till what end this continue while the whole world is looking at the people in Ukraine who are being perished since 2014 and will be perish in the future. The second question is that what is the ultimate goal of NATO expansion? Or are these Western, the G7, the genocidal 7 countries using NATO as a forefront excuse to their corporations' profits, that war is a profitable business agenda? That's my last question.
I think I can answer the second question more easily. The second question that you ask, what is the end goal? The end goal is to end any opposition to the hegemony, the dominance of the Western Empire led by the United States. It is already abundantly clear that that has failed. It has failed to stop, even slow, the rise of China. It has failed to break Iran, which it has sanctioned and made war upon over many decades, all of the decades actually of the Islamic Republic's existence. Totally failed. It has failed in the Ukraine, though it's still trying there. And we saw yesterday the horrific murder of children and women on a beach in Crimea, which they claim is part of Ukraine, and which means, therefore, the people they murdered were Ukrainians, families on a beach, by missiles supplied by the United States, and you heard Donald Coulter say, actually targeted by the United States. So they're still trying. They're still sending Ukrainians, old men, young boys, women, even pregnant women, being shanghaied into the armed forces of Zelensky, sent to the front, poorly trained, and in overwhelming numbers, straight to their deaths. So they have not yet failed in Ukraine, but they are failing. Their attempt to use Taiwan as a casus belli to weaken, divide, threaten, browbeat China into submission is not going to work. Increasingly, the population of Taiwan themselves know that they are being Ukrainianized, that they are being fattened up with American weapons and propaganda as a means of using Taiwan as another Ukraine. And they are rejecting it. At the same time, and I made this point in my monologue, the population in the Western countries is increasingly conscious of the extent to which their leaders are leading them to disaster. Never mind what they're doing to people overseas. There's an old nursery rhyme here, London Bridge is falling down, except it never actually did fall down. But bridges are falling down in the United States, it seems, every other week, and with disastrous consequences. The United States is coming apart at the seams. Its roads, its bridges, its railways, the living standards of its people, the number of people living on the streets. It's beginning to look like a Technicolor version of the 1930s Depression. And the public are beginning to ask, why are we sending all this money to NATO when we have such desperate need at home? In comes Donald Trump. He won't do anything meaningful to change it, but he will feast upon the rising tide of unhappiness in America at the way things are being run. It's incoherent. Some favor war with China, oppose it with Russia. Some hate Iran more, some hate the Palestinians more. It's incoherent. But if you aggregate it all, it is a huge majority in America that is revolting against the way that things are run and done in their country. The money laundering point that you made is a big one, and it's an important one. You know, when these sums are announced, 60 billion to Ukraine, 80 billion to Ukraine, most of it doesn't go to Ukraine. Some of it goes as a kickback to the corrupt regime that runs Ukraine to sniff up their nose or to spend on their beachfront properties that they are rapidly accumulating around the world. But most of it goes into the American military-industrial complex for new weapons, new profits for those arms companies, some of which they kick back into the American political system. It is a perfectly circular arrangement. And so far, they've gotten away with it. All these big American arms companies, Raytheon, Boeing, and so on, are achieving record profits. The arms that they deliver are quickly destroyed, and if they work at all, they work to murder people on a beach and change nothing in terms of the geostrategic balance and the inexorable march of Russia forward. But they sure as heck boost the shareholders' profits at the end of the year and the directors that work for them too. Thanks for that call from Addis Ababa. Kate Shemirani is in England, in East Sussex. Kate, go ahead. What would you like to ask?
Hi, George. We have met before. Thank you very much for having me on.
Is that you on stage?
That is me, and you ceremoniously dumped me off your show when I was actually telling the truth, and all that has now come to fruition.
Okay,
so
tell
I think
me
I'm
more.
exonerated.
Tell me more.
But anyway, let's go.
Tell me more.
You know, I called out the COVID con that the vaccines would injure. I was the first one in the UK to call it out before lockdown.
Well,
so that saw me get into a lot of trouble.
You were definitely right about
regardless of, yes, I was, and you've, you know, I said to you, now's an apology, George. I don't need an apology. You just need to unblock me on Twitter because I got my Twitter account back. Anyway, all that aside, let me get ahead. Let me get ahead with this. Okay, excellent. I want to ask you, should you be voted back into Parliament, will you publicly denounce the entire British moneyed establishment class?
Well, Kate, that's the easiest question I've ever been asked. Not only will I do daily, and I certainly will, I can assure you. We appear to have lost your line. I promise you that's not deliberate, and I will unblock you. In fact, my good wife's probably already done it before I get off the show. Scott Solomon is in New York City. Let's hear from Scott. Go ahead, Scott.
Hi, George. I was inspired by your hat to get my own little kufiya hat here. You can see the little
nice
kufiya
one. Let me be the first to congratulate you.
I wanted to heap more praise on you for your idea of these war crimes / crime against humanity tribunals that you have planned that focus on the media. The question I'm asking is, why are you exclusively focusing on the media? Wouldn't it be preferable to maybe corral in some people politically on your side, like Sarah Wagenknecht, or maybe the Podemos party in Spain, or maybe Mélenchon's group, and expand these tribunals to cover these monsters who have murdered tens of millions of people? Why should they get off the hook on these
No,
tribunals?
you're
Why are you
absolutely
only
right,
focusing
Scott.
on the?
You're absolutely right. The answer is, I want these tribunals that I have announced to spread all over the world, and everyone should hold their own tribunals. I'm only one man. We're only a small party. If I'm back in Parliament, we'll hold the hearings in Parliament. If I'm not back in Parliament, we'll do it elsewhere, but it's bite-sized chunks for me. I am able to hold the British media on trial. I'm able to do it because, like Paul Simon's song, The Boxer, I carry the reminder of everything that they have said and done as they cut me and made me cry out. I have felt every blow. I have watched every crime, every informational crime. Secondly, the manufacturing of consent for the crimes that have been committed is, if you think about it, the foundational stone. The reason your First Amendment is the First Amendment is because everything else flows from it. If you don't have free speech, you cannot have all these other components in your Constitution. So what we've had in the course of the last years, it's not just since October 7th over Gaza, it's not just even since 2014 over the Ukraine. It maybe will restrict it to the 21st century, in which case it will contain the holding of trials of the journalists and broadcasters that marched us into wars against Afghanistan, against Iraq, against Libya, against Syria, against Iran. All these conflicts will all be on the table. Now, I can manage that because I've got it all in my head. I'm not in a position to put little soldier Schultz on trial, much as I'd like to. But I hope and believe that my friend Sarah will be able to do that there, and ditto in every country. So I assure you, I'm not only going to hold journalists to account, I'm just going to hold the journalists to account first. Because without their lies, as Julian Assange once said, every war in our lifetime has been started on lies. And if we can expose the liars and make it more expensive for them the next time to spread their lies, then we may have done some good. My old friend, Erobos Abzu Iamashtu in New York City, good friend of the show. Erobos, welcome back to Have It Out with Galloway.
Greetings and salutations to you, Mr. G, the family, Have It Out with Galloway Moats. As far as Ukraine goes, yes, and to yourself as being the returning MP for the constituency of Rochdale and possibly even Prime Minister, I'm hoping. I even have my toes crossed. You can't see them, but I got them crossed. As far as Ukraine, I have a vision in my mind. It's like a tape of these dictators once the U.S. has give them the paper towel treatment. They use them up and throw them away. I have a vision of Zelensky in a stretch Mercedes van with bales, those suitcases full of money falling and then exploding onto the tarmac as he's racing towards his private jet. I think I have all indications, even from the beginning of this, once Russia intervened on October 7, 2022, I've always had the thought in my mind that it was going to end, it's going to be in Afghanistan. Hopefully not with people clinging on to aircraft and falling from hundreds of feet. Don't need to see that horror again. They've been through quite enough as it is. So I wanted to know, as far as your perspective, do you see something same or similar happening for the, I'm going to take a rare liberty here and say leadership as opposed to leadership of the territory that is Ukraine?
Well, thanks, Erobos. I don't think it will be as dramatic as the exit in the night, like thieves in the night, stealing away from the Afghanistan that they destroyed, leaving all their weapons and their material behind. I think it will be a changing of the guard, and I think I can see it hoving into view already. I think that the day will come, and come soon, that Zelensky will be blamed for all the failures and all the corruption, the grand larceny of the Ukrainian public purse, as well as, by extension, the Western taxpayer purse, and he'll be shoved to the side. And a new, probably military, Zaluzhny probably, will be brought forward. He will curse his predecessor, but will be allowed to retire gracefully to his one of his many residences, newly furnished around the world. I think that's more likely what will happen. But you can never be sure. It is the Wild West in Ukraine now, and they're all armed. And the day could come when one of his own colleagues takes a pistol to Zelensky and seizes power himself. That possibility must obviously be there. I don't know who's protecting Zelensky. I hope for his sake that they're good and that they're not viable, because there are many people in Ukraine, the wives and mothers of the soldiers that have been sent to die at the front. If they could get a hold of him, they would tear him apart. Soldiers and officers that have been ordered into battle when they knew that it was wrong and implausible, but were nonetheless told to have a summer counteroffensive, which of course achieved nothing but the death and destruction of so many hundreds of thousands of brave young soldiers. I think I'm probably reaching the end of the show, which is a pity because there are still several callers trying to get on the show, and I apologize to them. We'll try and prioritize them next time. I think it's been a marvelous tour of the horizon, a horizon that is on one level truly frightening, with war everywhere, in Dagestan, in Crimea, in the Donbass, around Kharkov, around Odessa, around the South China Sea, around the Red Sea, around the Black Sea. There is war and the weapons of war everywhere. But the most critical place to keep an eye on right now is what's going to happen in the next few days on the northern borders of occupied Palestine. Will the apartheid state be so unhinged that they launch an invasion of Lebanon? If they do, they will open the gates of hell. The Lebanese resistance, at least 100,000 soldiers strong, armed with the best of missiles, the best of anti-aircraft capability, and perhaps above all, armed with sincerity, armed with the truth, armed with the destiny of free peoples refusing to be subjugated. Because if that invasion happens, if all-out war were to break out between Israel and Lebanon, all kinds of people will ineluctably be drawn into the fray. And then it becomes incalculable where it's going. If the United States joins in, then others may join in too. I hope that you're all still around to join me next week at the same time, in the same place. Have it out with Galloway.